Hello everyone, welcome back to our online course on exploring sustainability in the Indian context. So today we have with us Manu Mathai. Manu is a professor at Azim Premji University, and today we'll start a new module with Manu on looking at situating sustainability. But Manu, before we get into this, maybe we'll do a quick recap for everyone on where we've gone so far in the course. So this far we have discussed how we look at framing sustainability. What do we mean by sustainability? And we said we're looking at sustainability along the axes of the three F's. So we're looking at finitude, we're looking at fragility, and we're looking at fairness. We spoke about what these three are and how they relate to some big issues of sustainability. We examined the issue of population versus consumption. We looked at the issue of food and sustainability, and finally we looked at climate change, which is one of the most pressing global concerns of sustainability. Now in this module, we're looking at how to move towards sustainability and what is the role played by certain other forces, which is basically nature, culture, markets and society and state. Yeah. And let's look at these in greater detail with Manu through the course.
Sure.
So now that we've discussed how to frame sustainability and some of the issues, I'm sure many of you are thinking about how to move. Okay, now what do we do with this, right? And one common way of thinking of doing something about sustainability is going green. And I'm sure you've read this in your newspapers, in college campaigns, in community campaigns. People talk about going green. What exactly do you mean by going green? It could be a range of things, right, Manu? It could be things like stopping using plastic bags. It could be moving towards public transport. Maybe people are saying plant trees. People are saying move towards renewable energy. So actions you take as individuals, actions you take as societies. But how do we actually do this at a large scale to go green or move towards sustainability?
Sure. So all of the things that you just said, Harini, would actually count as actions, like you rightly said, towards sustainability. But something that we should do is to just pause for a second and to ask at a more fundamental level, what's actually driving modern societies towards the status of being largely unsustainable? What are some of the foundational drivers? And to do that, what we'll do is we'll explore these categories that you had mentioned earlier on about nature, culture, markets and the state, and unpack what they mean and how the meanings that we attach to them are more foundational. Are foundational drivers either towards sustainability or less so, right, away from sustainability.
So Manu, you spoke of these foundational categories, right? So let's take one of the examples we spoke about while going green. Let's talk about the issue of plastic bags. Can we talk about the example of how we got to the state of using plastic bags and what we can do to move away from it and illustrate some of these ideas that you spoke about?
Sure. Plastic is actually a very good example to use to talk through these foundational categories, right? So if you come to just ask ourselves, how have we come to inhabit this world of plastic, right, all around us? We have plastic shopping, you name it, every kind of thing we touch is full of plastic. How did we come to this point? And what I'd suggest, and that's the content of this lecture, is just to kind of preview that, what I'd suggest is the way we think about nature, culture, markets and state all have influenced this kind of status that plastic enjoys today. So let's take nature for example. Something like this, the prevalence of plastic that we have today wouldn't have been possible if hydrocarbons weren't so cheap. So to make hydrocarbons so cheap, you have to actually see, understand, and nature has to mean something, right? You can't just have a reverence or a sacredness around nature. That would curtail a lot of these uses. Similarly, if you look at culture, you actually have to get into this convenience of using plastic. Plastics, no doubt, enhance convenience, make life much faster, much lighter. Shippers, manufacturers can ship more things out. If you're a vegetable fruit sale farmer, you can sell more fruits. That calls for a certain culture, a culture of consumption, a culture of speed. These are not things that pre-existed. These are things that societies and cultures have actually created, imagined into existence. Right? These are not kind of laws of physics, for example, which didn't exist, which existed from time immemorial. So cultures have had to change. You can think of the state. The state has played crucial roles here in terms of regulating or not regulating this use of nature. Or you can think about markets. Markets in some sense dictate a certain pace of economic activity, commercial activity. So if you can put more apples in a truck by using plastic packaging, you can sell more apples at a faster speed, right? As opposed to if you're using more cumbersome packaging, then the volumes of sales go down. So markets have also kind of dictated this use, this emergence. So plastics actually is a very good kind of segue into each of introducing these categories, right? And how they've had to be imagined and reimagined, so that we live now. The abundance of plastic is just something that's normalized and naturalized.
So that was a nice introduction, I think, with the plastic example, seeing how something as simple as our decision to take a plastic bag for shopping or not is impacted by all of these categories. Maybe it's time now then to look at these a little more in detail. Shall we start with nature? And if Manu, you could explain to us what we mean by the category of nature in terms of sustainability.
Sure. Right. I think, let's start with a good definition of how to understand nature for the purposes of this lecture, right? At one level, nature is very obvious. It's all around us, right? And I think we learn in high school or even before that nature is the living and the non-living part. So what are the non-living aspects of nature? Everything from the seasons to photosynthesis, the hydrological cycle, what have you. The rocks, plate tectonics, if you want to take a really long time scale, all of this would count as nature. On the other hand, the living aspect side of nature would be us included, everything from microorganisms to the blue whale and everything in between, right? That would be nature as well. But an important thing that we should keep in mind while thinking about nature and talking about nature in the context of this lecture is remember that nature is not a static background, right? And especially in the context of human societies, human civilization, nature has changed, always has changed, right? As a result of human actions. At various scales, and we'll discuss more about these various scales and so forth. But more recently in history, towards our time, these scales have become so vast, and so we see them more easily.
So what you're saying is that nature influences us, and we influence nature, right? And this process, though, of how we are shaped by nature and how we shape nature, is really influenced a lot in itself by culture, right?
Just think of culture as the world of meanings within which we live, right? And it is through this world of meanings that we see the world outside, right? And know what to do with it and how to interact with it and so forth. Let me take an example now. The people tree is a fairly common tree that you find in India, and all of us in India would readily recognize that the people tree is given a certain sense of sacredness. Now the sacredness of the people tree is not some pre-existing, pre-social category. It is purely something that culture gives to the people tree. So in the Indian kind of cultural milieu, the people tree commands this notion of sacredness. In a different culture, it's just another old tree, which could be used for timber and nothing would have mattered, right? But in Indian context, we look at it in the language of sacred. What could be another example, right? In a kind of urban industrial context, like Bangalore, for example, where we are, urban industrial context, there is this tendency to look at human beings, not just Bangalore, but the urban industrial context largely, tend to look at human beings as labor, right? And then the conversation, we very readily, all of us subject ourselves to that role. There's a question of maximizing the productivity of labor, using labor efficiently, allocating labor, etc., etc., etc. What we're doing is we're taking one dimension of a human being and focusing on that, right? But that's only allowed in a certain kind of cultural context, industrial context, if you will. The moment I go back home, or Harni, when you go back home, you're no longer labor. You are probably labor as part of the story, but your mother, your spouse, and you're also known as somebody who's working outside the house, a breadwinner, all these things kind of. So you occupy these multiple kinds of identities. So in an industrial culture, you and I would be labor. But in a family, in a social, much more social context, the culture of those spaces, we would be friends, we would be spouses, we would be parents, siblings, so on and so forth, right? So that's so. Just take away with you that the idea of culture is this world of meanings through which we see the world and know how to relate to the world.
So we spoke of nature and we've spoken of culture. What about the third category, markets?
Yeah, markets actually also, like culture, they're also human institutions. They've evolved with human civilization, and they've evolved to enable exchange of goods and services, either through bartering initially, then through trade, Of course, markets today have taken on extremely high levels of sophistication, so they've evolved and changed in dramatically different ways. But one thing to remember at the start is to remember that markets have always been with human civilization. It's not a new thing, right? But that is not to say that they have not changed dramatically. But one thing, just as a preview in this conversation about markets, I'd say is that whereas historically markets were embedded within society, today it's more like societies are embedded within markets, right? It is the goings on in the markets that determine politics, they determine social stability, and so on and so forth. So it's pretty likely I can make a safe bet and say that most of us started the day by reading the newspaper, and some of the information we encounter on a daily basis would involve things like the Bombay Stock Exchange, the price of gold, the price of oil, what have you, right? And these numbers are not just insignificant numbers. The finance minister of the country would wake up to those numbers. The Governor of the Reserve Bank would do the same thing, right? And so markets have come to occupy an extremely dominant position today. We'll unpack that a little more as we go along later.
And it's not just the price of the stock exchange in gold, right? So if I think back to a few years ago, governments in India have fallen because of the rising price of onions, something as simple as that, right? So that brings us to the state, actually.
Sure.
Can you talk about the state then and define that?
So the moment Harmi and I said state, most of us would have thought about state of Karnataka, state of Kerala, or a wannabe state like Delhi. So that's one use of the word state, right? The meaning in which we are using state for this lecture in this module is to think of it as a political association, right? And that has the ability, usually through a government, to exert political authority, right? In pursuit of certain goals. So you can think of it as the state having a certain will, right? So a political association, through the instruments of government, exerts its will, right? And that would be how we would think about a country and so forth. But the important question for our lecture and our module would be, how does this will come about? What does it mean to say that a state has will? How is that will created? These are very important questions from the point of view of sustainability. For example, the state's will is to ignore air pollution in our cities, or take a very ambivalent attitude about it. You're going to see a lot of air pollution and a lot of health effects, and as a result of that. Or the state's will is to turn a blind eye to, say, mining. That's not a particularly sustainable outcome, right? So the question about how the state's will is formulated, how it's created, is important for us to dwell on in the context of discussions around sustainability. And we'll do more of that when we get to the discussion on state in a subsequent lecture.
So that was a quick introduction to these 4 categories, right? One thing was, when you're talking about these categories, you mentioned a lot the fact that our understanding of each of them is something that is very fluid. It's changed over time, it's not fixed. Now, why is that important to stress?
Okay, Hari, it's actually a very, very interesting question. I think there's some explanation here. Why we emphasize fluidity? Because see, it is through this fluidity that possibilities for change exist, right? Take for example, let's just assume, for example, that culture was immutable. And now take the example of a car culture where everybody's just driving around in their private cars, right? Assume that was immutable, and we're faced with something like climate change, or a city, urban air pollution, and so forth. And something has to give way. We know that this culture has to change, but if it was immutable, there's no conversation to be had, right? But the fact is that driving has never been a constant in human history. It's a very recent invention. It's a cultural invention. It was imagined into existence and then materialized in various ways. By that very virtue, it can also be reimagined. How we move around is open to cultural reinterpretation, reimagination, right? And that gives us a lot of hope. I think that's very critical to remember, that this fluidity of these categories and how they play out is what opens up, when we talk about actions towards sustainability, this is what helps us think about sustainability in new ways, actions that we can undertake to change for the better, right? Now, so when we talk about fluidity, that's one thing. Just by way of passing mention should be made here of the idea of there are phenomena that are actually immutable, right? There are ecology, sustainability occupies this very interesting space where you have this idea of what we call social construction, right, where ideas are imagined anew, for example, and fixed realities, laws of physics, for example. So something like, say, the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which you all talked a lot about in the previous lecture, I understand, right? And how that correlates to, say, the global average temperatures. That is not something that we can imagine or reimagine. That's a physical principle, right? It is what it is. Now, how you can respond to that, that is the part that society has agency in, is able to do something of its own accord, right? How we decide to live, how we decide to move, these are all things that can be imagined anew. And nature, our understandings of nature, understandings of culture, the market, the state, and the fluidity that all of them have will help us in that process, right? That's why fluidity is key for this conversation.
So we've covered a great deal of ground in this lecture. Maybe this is a good time. Manu, could you summarize for our audience what are the key take-home messages from today's conversation?
Sure, yeah. So I think the main takeaways would be, one thing would be, remember the 4 categories we spoke about, right? Nature, culture, markets, and state. It's important to remember that we spoke of these as spaces through which we pursue sustainability, or we can also arrive at the opposite outcome, right? Where lack of sustainability, right? So those categories are important to keep in mind. The second idea here is that there is a great deal of fluidity around these, the understandings of these categories, right? That none of them are fixed. The meanings of nature are not fixed. Cultures are not fixed. Markets are not fixed. They've occupied different types of state forms are also not fixed. These things have changed over history, right? And so we must remember that they're open to reinterpretation and reimagination depending on the problems that we're confronted with. And in this case, the conversation is around sustainability, right? And the last point I would make is that this reimagination is important from just from a point of view of being hopeful about realizing that there are possibilities in this kind of pursuit for sustainability, right? That there is hope in this fluidity.
Thanks, Manu. So, any parting words for the audience?
Sure, why not? We can leave them some homework, right? And so, one of the things that we were thinking that maybe you all could work on is pick a movie from the 1950s, pick a movie from, say, the past 2 or 3 years, a contemporary movie, and make a comparison between these 2 movies, right? And the thing that we want you all to compare is how are these different movies representing ideas of the nature, of the state, of markets, of culture, how are these categories represented, right? And interestingly, these are representing 2 different periods in this country's history. One is post-independence, one is 20 years after liberalization. So it perhaps offers you an interesting comparison.
And that should be a fun piece of homework too, right?
Hope
so. So as always, write into the discussion forum, tell us what you found, what you think about it, and we'll love to have a conversation with you about these issues. Right? So with that, thanks again very much, Manu, for doing this.
Welcome.
And bye everyone. We'll see you again in the next lecture where Manu will delve deeper into the first of our 4 categories, which is on nature. See you.
Thank you.